So today I'm going to talk about a study we conducted towards the end of semester 1, because we wanted to engage with the students, particularly those who were in year 1 that we hadn't had the opportunity to meet face to face in the flesh, and to establish the impact that lockdown was having on them, to be able to identify potential support needs. So we're all conscious of low response rates to standard questionnaires, and we were becoming more and more aware of the challenges of even getting students to engage face-to-face online. So we came up with the idea of collecting data on wellbeing using phone messaging, predominantly with the use of emojis. And that was a concept that had been looked at by the mental health charity Mind. So it was a slightly validated method. So just to provide context of what was going on at that particular time, so we're looking at about 9 months ago. So our students were dealing with a number of transitional changes. So the COVID-19 pandemic was ongoing. We had no clear idea at the time what impact that was having on the students' mental health and their learning. Many of the students were staying at home or being isolated in their accommodation. And we know that even without the pandemic, the challenges of social and academic progress in higher education are linked to the development or exacerbation of mental health issues. So studies that were carried out very early on in the pandemic had suggested that there was a heightened risk of loneliness compared to pre-COVID times, particularly in the 18 to 30s age group. And that age group encompassed 90% of our students at that time. So remote learning was depriving the students of many of the opportunities to network with their peers. And for our students in health sciences, we were also preparing them for the transition from online classes into clinical placement with peers that they'd never met and professionals that they'd never met either. So as a team, we put on weekly quiz nights. The students who engaged with those, so we had some regular attendees and they engaged really well. And we had our regular academic advisor meetings, but we still had no real idea as a cohort what their well-being and their kind of main issues of the students were. So the study aim was to primarily identify well-being and establish the key factors that were impacting on the health professional students' mental health using the novel approach for data collection and engagement. So we opened the study to all year 1 pre-registration undergraduate radiotherapy students, which was our programme, of which there were 42 students in that cohort. So 15 of those signed up to take part in the study. And when they signed the consent form, they were given a phone number for a phone which was manned by one of our research team, and it wasn't being used for any other purposes, so it was purely for that reason. And what they were asked to do was send a WhatsApp message to the phone to say hello, which signalled their engagement with the study. And then their phone number was saved as a contact in that phone as a participant number. So the researcher who manned the phone was a different person to the one who was recruiting and consenting students, so they were completely anonymous from anyone that was receiving that information. So we also asked them to remove their photo from their WhatsApp profile because we were aware that that was a way of identifying them, so that maintained their anonymity as well. So over the study period, which was 3 weeks, they were sent a daily message from the research phone as a broadcast in WhatsApp, so that the message was sent to each of them, but their response only came back to the researcher. So it's slightly different to a group messaging where you put all the numbers in and send out one message. Broadcast allows you to type in one message, send it to everybody, and then get the responses separately. So that was quite important as well. That message asked them to send one emoji that best represented their overall well-being for that day. And as part of the participant information, we suggested that they used only emojis with faces, but otherwise we didn't restrict what type of emoji they used. We thought it was important to let them express and for us to understand what kind of emojis that group would choose in this preliminary study. At the end of each week, they were asked to send a text message alongside the emojis with factors that had improved or reduced their well-being for that week to help us kind of understand the context of those emoji responses. And at the end of the study, they were also asked for a final text message summarising their feelings on support, both what was available to them and what they felt would have been required or would have been useful. So due to the lightning nature of the talk, I'm not going to focus on that very last bit today. The emoji data was, and the free text data was then transcribed from the phone to a spreadsheet. And overall, there were 254 emoji responses, which was an 89% response rate. So that was really good. And in those emoji responses, there are actually 104 different emoji used by the students. So they were able to express it in whatever way they felt was appropriate. So we then grouped the emojis into themes and then sent those groupings back out to the participants so that they can validate those groups. And that process was supported by literature which suggests that different age groups of people identify emoji differently. And as a team, and I can see Pete's joined us now, we can accept that we're an age where we couldn't confidently say we're still down with the kids enough to necessarily identify them the same. So they validated that data for us. They were then asked, as part of that questionnaire where they validated the data, what they thought about the data collection method. So there's a lot of data that we got from it, and this is just a summary, but in the centre you can see the graph which is displaying the emoji responses in themed groups. So from left to right is kind of the timeline. So the first week that we collected the data was the final academic week of semester 1. And the data was continued to be collected then through the weekends and through the first 2 weeks of their clinical placement block, up to the final weekend, which was actually the weekend before Christmas. So what we can see is it shows a relative increase in the use of the happy emojis, which are the yellow bars, through the weeks, with quite a significant kind of link to tiredness at the end of the academic block, and then some concern just before placement started, which we can see then reduced over time. And we felt that these emoji gave us a good overview of how students were feeling as a collective, and at this point probably matched what we might have anticipated because of what they were going into as a new environment. But we were confident that the responses due to the method of data collection weren't being influenced by any of our preconceptions. So we then undertook some thematic analysis of the weekly text responses to triangulate with the emoji themes, as well as looking at the frequency of the types of responses that we were getting, to correlate those with the emoji frequency. So we wanted to kind of see whether what they were saying matched up with those emotive responses. So the negative themes tended to relate to placement, tiredness, workload, and social interaction. And the comments that they were making were around new routines and learning, a lack of places to go and exercise, limited contact with their friends and family, and anxiety and apprehension around placement and their achievement in placement. The positive responses were supported by themes such as social interaction, a sense of purpose, health, well-being, and routine. And they were given examples such as being welcomed into the clinical departments by staff, having the opportunity to meet people from the course in placement, a sense of having a positive impact and a full and productive day, I think, which was particularly prevalent at that time when we weren't getting the opportunity to do those kind of things, and taking the opportunity to go out for walks and get exercise as well. So overall, we could see that the quantity and the themes of the weekly text comments were supporting that overall wellbeing pattern that was being established from the emoji that were coming through. So the other part of the study was to evaluate the actual method of data collection. And we also then themed the text responses, the free text responses that we got from the students. So the most frequently identified positive strengths of the method was its efficiency. And this perception of the students was also supported by the speed of the responses that we noticed as researchers when we were manning the phone, which in many cases was minutes or seconds from the request. So the request for a daily emoji was sent out and students were responding to that within seconds or minutes. So this might not be a surprise because in the UK, it's estimated that adults check their phone on average every 12 minutes of the waking day. But it did also indicate that the simplicity of responding possibly meant that they didn't procrastinate over sending that response, whereas a questionnaire sometimes sits in somebody's inbox even if they've seen it for quite a long time. The students also highlighted that the anonymous nature of their responses was a positive, and they suggested that they could be as honest as they wanted to be. The third most common positive feature was that it had little consequence. So they felt this was a positive because they could offload how they felt without being vulnerable or without feeling vulnerable. and without then having to follow it up with full discussion. Sometimes people want to say what they think, but they don't really want to have to follow that up and have discussions about it. So in terms of the limitations, they felt that the method, the simplicity meant that responses might be misinterpreted, and that the method provided just a snapshot of their emotions, which was therefore potentially a bit superficial and didn't really explain the reasons for those moods. As well as being a positive, the anonymity was seen as being a negative, in that any support that could be offered as a result would then have to be general rather than personalised to them. And then by not receiving responses, there was really kind of little direct consequence or outcome from that participation. That said, when they were asked whether they would have wanted a response, 90% of those students said no. And 50% of them actually said that they would have responded the same way, whether it had been anonymous or not. One of the participants actually said in their kind of free text response, they thanked the researchers for the opportunity to reflect using emoji, which really I think is quite an interesting takeaway thought, that was how they perceived it, that benefit of being able to reflect. So from our experiences of using the method in this initial study, we identified some limitations and some recommendations. So we stipulated that a single emoji response was sent, which is non-onerous for the participant to construct or for the researchers to interpret, really. But it might not represent their overall day. And I think we all know that from filling out questionnaires where you have to provide a single response. Sometimes you feel like it might be a little bit of a combination of multiple. So being allowed to provide multiple emoji responses may give a broader picture of their mental health. In the format of our study, there was no plan to provide a response to the participants' emojis or comments. And we kind of identified between ourselves what might constitute the need to break from that. And it was quite challenging as a researcher when I received a string of negative emoji from one particular individual, not being able to act on that. But that was what the participants had signed up to, so we needed to respect that as well. So for the researcher manning the phone, it was a daily commitment that you needed to remember to send out a daily message requesting that response. And also the use of texting for students could potentially blur the boundaries between home study and home life. So none of the participants actually mentioned that in their feedback, but one of them did stop responding after 8 days, and we don't know what the reason for that was. So being sent a message and being reminded about study to something personal like a mobile phone might kind of blur that boundary a little bit. So for anyone considering trying this, our recommendations would be to set out clear boundaries and expectations on both sides before starting. Texting is a very casual form of communication, which we've demonstrated to be really effective in terms of engagement, but it's slightly at odds with a general university communication strategy. So if the teachers or researchers are going to respond, it would be important to set out clear expectations with the students about maybe how and why and when that would happen. We looked at a relatively short period of time, and longitudinal data collection across a year and maybe for several years of study might help to identify key points of emotional change for the cohort rather than sometimes we get responses from individuals. So that might provide a pattern for different cohorts across a year, and that might enable more proactive rather than just reactive support to be put in place. The method used would support more formal evaluation with larger cohorts, and as a team we'd really embrace the opportunity to work with a larger group if anyone was interested in looking at that with us. And looking to the future, we see the potential for the development of maybe an app that could support an automated response based on students' emoji patterns, considering the potential for it to kind of triage to support both humans linked directly to the programme of study or to some self-directed resources that the students can access. And there we go. So if anyone's got any questions, we'd be really happy to, and I can see Pete and Flora are both here with us as well. So if anyone's got any questions, we'd be happy to answer them.
That's great. Thanks, Jenny. So please, either questions if you want to type them in the chat, or please feel free to come in on the audio.
Yeah, can I just say, Jenny, that thanks for sharing. That's a great example of research on students' feedback. And I mean, I have a practical question that did you say that in terms of the emoji interpretation that you had to get students to analyze it? Because I have been looking for, I have been looking at maybe designing more visual type questionnaires exactly for the reasons that you've mentioned. But what I haven't come across is like a dictionary where you can cut and paste an emoji and it will tell you. I'm sure it exists, but
So yeah, they do exist online. There are kind of group, if you go on, I think if you Google them, really, I was having a look the other day, there are definitions for certain types of emojis, but we found that there are a few papers, not many, that look at kind of the different interpretations, particularly between age groups of people and how they feel that they represent them. There was one in particular, it was the upside down smiley face emoji that we interpreted as a positive, and they told us that that wasn't a positive, it was more of a negative response. So there's some that are more clear cut than others. So there weren't many that they asked us to swap in categories, but they do exist as kind of lists. We just wanted to make sure for the cohort that had responded, we were taking their understanding of it and interpreting that correctly. So yes, you're absolutely right. There are some kind of set categories, but I think when you do have a cohort that are using them, either establishing them beforehand, that's what they think. We kind of thought about it retrospectively, if I'm honest. We thought we needed to validate them when we got them through.
That's great, because one of the things I'm interested in is multimodality, and with anything with visual or metaphorical, you do need to check back, or as you have asked as well, like commentary on the emotions, because different pictures or images might mean different things to different people, and as you say, can be culturally different as well of how people express themselves. So or just I've been with some younger people today recently, and they were saying sick as being like really cool, and that's not necessarily how I would say it, but yeah. So thank you, that's really interesting.